So why is now the time to invest in South Sudan? Friends, there's an urgency behind our work. South Sudan is bearing fruit, but it won't always be that way. The soil will get harder someday. I've seen it before. See, I've been traveling to South Sudan since 2007, almost 17 years. And that's longer than they've even been a country. And I've seen a lot of things in my time. Illiteracy, famine, poverty, war. Those were the years of the seed on the path. Because of generations of struggle, the birds were snatching the seed right off the path. Satan was literally keeping God's words out of the hearts of the people. We're told that man doesn't live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. But how can they hear unless someone tells them? And how can someone tell them unless they're sent? And so God asks, whom shall I send? Who will go for us? It was during those years of war that God provided an answer that we might not have expected. It was the South Sudanese themselves who fled to neighboring countries. As refugees, they began to experience different things: learning, opportunity, good news, hope. As their own country fluctuated in and out of war, they began to return armed with the gospel. As the soil was ripe, but it was also rotten. These were the years of the seed on the rocky soil. There was much joy springing up, churches being planted, pastors being commissioned, but there was no depth of root. And inevitably, when the heat returned, so much of that newborn fruit was scorched by the blazing fire. So often the discouragements that come in a war-torn nation wither the seed that grows. And that was South Sudan when they became their own country in 2011. A nation with shallow soil, open to the gospel, but never with deep root. In our early years at Every Village witnessed all these things. We scattered the seed far and wide through a radio network. Solar radios were like Bibles in the hands of the people. I mean, for the first time ever, villages without a single book were able to hear the word of God in their native tongue. And the famished soil ate it up. And even today, radio in South Sudan is the single biggest influencer of the masses. And while radio does the hard work of the farmer, scattering seed far and wide, the people also need to dig deep to grow strong roots so they don't wither during life's struggles. In a word, they need root. In church, we call this discipleship. In nation building, we call it sustainability. Call it what you will, this is the necessary ingredient to bear lasting fruit. And it starts with raising up leaders, disciples who make other disciples. And when you get to this type of soil, the farmer knows there's an urgency to get planting. Because the more you sow, the more you grow. 30, 60, 100 times what is sown. And that's where we are today in South Sudan. We've entered the season of the fertile soil. The ground has been made ready. The seeds are being sown, and the fruit is feeding a nation. So this is the opportunity we have before us tonight to catch this vision, that in our lifetime, we can see South Sudan becoming a nation for Christ. And we see a South Sudan where the kids of today grow up in a world totally different from their parents. A world where they never remember a time they didn't have access to the Bible. A world where they don't even know what it's like to drink dirty water. A world with learning, opportunity, good news, hope. This world is possible. In fact, it's happening. But there's still a lot of work to ensure that it lasts. And that's why now is the time to invest in South Sudan. So for the next 25 minutes, I want to invite you to come and see how God is changing the world's youngest nation. Now, I want to start by looking at this map. You might have seen something like this before. It's a map showing worldwide access to electricity. But just imagine if this map instead represented access to the gospel. After all, it's not too far of a stretch, because wherever the gospel goes, it shines a light in the darkest places. And while having access to electricity doesn't ensure access to the gospel, the reverse is so often true. In countries that don't have reliable access to electricity, so often the people don't have reliable access to the gospel as well. But it doesn't have to be this way. Let's look at South Sudan on this map. Here it is in East Africa. As you'd expect, it's totally black. In fact, South Sudan ranks lowest in the world when it comes to access to electricity. Only about 7% of the population has any access. The next closest country is over 10%. Truly, most people in South Sudan are still living like they did 2,000 years ago, in the dark. But we're not a power company, so why do we care about electricity rates? Well, with such a rural, unreached population, it presents quite the challenge to bring the light of the gospel there as well. When Jesus told his followers to be witnesses in Jerusalem, Judea and Samaria, and to the ends of the earth, he might have been thinking about South Sudan. Here we are 2,000 years later, and there are still villages that have never had the gospel brought their way. That's how remote we're talking. But that's why we're called to this work. We're going places where no one else will go. In fact, every village just opened up South Sudan's newest airstrip. Now, this isn't a place without any roads. The only way to access it before was by river. So we built our own airstrip. And in January, I was with a team that landed on it for the very first time. It was bumpy, but it was also amazing. The kids gathering to witness something they've never seen in their entire lives, an airplane in their village. I mean, honestly, it's hard for us to imagine something like this, right? A plane to these kids is kind of like a UFO would be to us. And just think how we'd react if a UFO landed right in our front yard. That's the kind of impact we're talking about. But let me go back to this map, because it shouldn't have to be this way. Why is the U.S. lit up while huge stretches of our world are in the dark? Why do we have an average of 4.3 Bibles collecting dust on our shelves at home when places like South Sudan don't even have one in an entire village? This is why South Sudan remained dark for so many years. But all that started to change in 2009. That was the year a new light went on in the country. That was the year we built our first radio station. Reaching out over 50 miles in every direction, the station was built in a wheel, the most densely populated area of the country. This broadcast alone covers over 1 million people, and Philip Yai and his team are hard at work every day bringing the gospel, the good news of the kingdom of God over the radio waves. Now, in our early years, we depended on so many others for help. KHCB for technical advice, KSBJ for training, Galcom for radios. Sometimes it felt like we only had 5 loaves and 2 fish to offer. But God has taken our little and has multiplied it to the many. The people of a wheel are being fed their daily word for the very first time, and it has completely changed this region. The church has grown tremendously in our time. Pastors have told us again and again that radio has made church planting easy for them because people in the most remote villages are hearing the gospel in their native tongue now. And they're coming to these pastors asking, begging for a church to be planted in their village. Truly, South Sudan is the single biggest driver to biblical literacy in radio is in South Sudan today. I mean, that's why pastors love the radio. And here's the result. In December, we held our 7th local listener support campaign. Yeah, we asked the South Sudanese to give money to their station. And in December, we had 42,000 listeners give money to their pastors who walked the long distance to the station to deliver the money. These pastors came from 1,036 different churches and over 50 denominations, all of them giving money to their local community radio station. And they do it because radio is helping support their growth. So many of these partnering churches have been planted since that first radio light came on in 2009. Now, just to put in perspective that number of churches, just imagine if every single church in the Austin area donated to their local Christian radio station, and then add another 285 churches. It's simply incredible how God is using radio in South Sudan. And that's not the end of the story. In 2012, our second light came on in the country. This reached another 700,000 people with the gospel. And it was built in Tanj at a very strategic place of the country that's at the crossroads of a few major tribes. More lights came on. In 2016, we built our Mavolo station. This one is beloved by the Jur people. And I remember being there in South Sudan when the very first Jur Modo words were uttered for the first time in the history of the world on the radio. And within minutes, Peter Bede, our radio manager, his phone was ringing off the hook with excited community members saying they were hearing his voice on the radio. Well, our radio network continued to grow. In 2020, we built our first repeater tower in a place called Mario Bay. Our wheel station had become so popular that we had dozens of pastors coming from 50 miles to the west begging us to extend the broadcast range to reach their villages. We did just that, to reach another 250,000 people who didn't have the good news before. Then in 2022, we extended our reach once more to move Tanj to the northeast to a very remote place called Nyapagok. 5 towers now, reaching 3 million people. But we're not done. Remember South Sudan's newest airstrip? This is in the region of Nasser, where we've broken ground to build our 6th radio station. And this is going to be the only station in the entire region, and it's going to be reaching the 2nd largest tribe in South Sudan. But even then, South Sudan won't be covered in light yet. There will still be dark corners, and we want Jesus to be known in every village. So over the next decade, God has given us the vision to shine even brighter by building another 15 radio stations to make sure that South Sudan is no longer in the dark. Remember that vision, to see South Sudan as a nation for Christ, where kids don't remember a time they didn't know God's word. That's certainly going to be the case for Michael Kahn's daughter. In 2019, this local musician's little girl fell sick, and she was almost at the point of death. That very day, Simon Dokpaya, one of our pastors on the radio, felt led to pray for the sick over the radio waves. So he invited all the listeners that were nearby a sick family member to lay hands on them as he prayed. Well, filled with a mustard seed of faith in that moment, Michael and his wife laid their hands on their dying daughter. And as Simon prayed, she revived, and she sat up and she began asking food and water. She quickly recovered. Because of a miraculous story, Michael has now dedicated his life to composing songs for the radio. I mean, if that story sounds like it's straight out of the Gospels, that's because it is. Truly, God is working through radio in South Sudan in biblical proportions. And that's why we need to make sure that every person has access to news like this. And that's where our solar-powered radios come in. All time, we brought 172,000 solar radios, just like the ones you see at your centerpieces. And we don't, to strengthen local ownership, we don't give these radios away for free. We ask the South Sudanese to contribute to buy their radios. And over the years, the South Sudanese have brought almost $180,000 to purchase their radios. This coming from one of the poorest countries in the world. But they do it because they're so hungry for the gospel. Well, 172,000 sounds like a lot. With our vision to cover this land with the light of the gospel by radio, we need another 850,000 radios in the coming years just to keep up with demand. That's going to be over 1 million radios all time, enough to make sure that every home has access to the radio. And that will change a nation. That's a bold vision, a God-sized vision. But we serve a God-sized God, and he wants every village to have access to the gospel. And remember, each one of these radios is like a flashlight in a dark room. Little by little, we're pushing back the darkness. Home by home, we're bringing light to this nation. But we can't take these lights for granted. Because if we weren't there, no one else would be. Millions of people wouldn't have access to the Bible. Millions would still be in the dark. That's the cost of not reaching our vision. That's why there's such an urgency to our work. Now, I need to add at this point that while radio is an amazing tool to scatter the seeds far and wide, as I mentioned at the beginning, people also need to dig deep to grow strong roots. And that's where discipleship comes in. See, we're not just about seeing churches grow. We want to see healthy churches grow. And here's where the hard work begins. There's just no way to do this with a short-term relief mindset. It takes deep relationship, local knowledge, and a ton of grit. But that's what we've got at every village. Now, I want to show you this graphic to explain how our ministry works together. We have a vision to extend our reach broader, even as we go deeper at a village level. And that's why we chose the name Every Village in the first place. Every represents the reach. Village represents the depth. And right at the top, reaching millions is radio. Such broad reach. I mean, we've been talking about that. And just below it is our water program called the Sustainable Water Cooperative. And I'll get to that more in a moment. But both our radio program and our water program are reaching South Sudan at a national level. These are foundational building blocks for a young nation. But I want to draw our attention to the next 4 sections, each going progressively deeper, because each of these partnerships make up what we call our discipleship program. Now, the first is the pastor conferences. These have become the largest annual gathering for church leaders at a regional level. We host these conferences every year. We bring various church leaders from around the globe to teach. We've covered topics like expository preaching, the mission of the church, the biblical basis for marriage. Each year builds on the last and is having a lasting impact on the Big C church. Last October, for example, we had 1,488 pastors from 795 different churches walk the long distance, sometimes 2 or even 3 days to attend the conferences. I mean, this kind of church unity across denomination just doesn't happen in our world that often. Add in the fact that South Sudan's history has been filled with conflict, and these gatherings are even more important. And God has placed every village right at the center of all this, bringing the church together like never before. And while these conferences are incredible at bringing hundreds of pastors together at a time, we also recognize the need to go even deeper with pastors, equipping them with sound doctrine. And that goes to the bottom segment, where we partnered with World Hope Initiatives International to launch 3-year Bible institutes to provide a theological education to a smaller group of pastors. As David mentioned, he is the one that introduced us to World Hope a few years ago, and we're so grateful. And we celebrated the graduation of our first 35 pastors just in February. We're humbled to be a part of this. We don't take it for granted, this opportunity to invest in so many church leaders in this nation. They are constantly asking us to have access to more resources to support them in their ministry efforts. So that's why we decided to start showing the Jesus film and playing it on speakers given to us by our friends at Turtlebox. This production has been translated into all the languages where we work, and it's become a key way for us to invest in church leaders at a community level. Every weekend, different pastors host Jesus film showings near their church, and every weekend we hear testimonies of lives changed. Stories like Mary Eli, who watched the film with 600 neighbors just a few weeks ago. She had been a non-believer and a drunkard, but she was inspired by the story of Mary Magdalene being forgiven by Jesus. And watching the film, Mary Eli realized that she too could be forgiven just like Mary Magdalene. So she put her trust in Jesus, and Mary has now been baptized with 229 others who committed their lives to Christ that night. I mean, these are the stories we hear every weekend. Praise Jesus. I got to go to my first Jesus film showing in January. We arrived at dusk to set up, and one of the church ladies began to beat the drum to call anyone within earshot to the show. See, they don't have cell phones to send out group texts. This is the way the South Sudanese are invited to come and see. And over the next 20 to 40 minutes, more and more people wandered in from the bush. And by the time the film had started, over 300 people had gathered to witness the greatest story ever told. So many people wanted a front row seat that a whole group of them moved to the back side of the screen and watched the film in mirror image. I mean, honestly, it's hard for us to imagine the impact that one film can have when our entire world is surrounded by screens, just like this room, right? But for most in South Sudan, the Jesus film is the first movie they've ever seen in their entire lives. The story of Jesus coming alive in their hearts. But let's keep going, because this next partnership is near and dear to my heart, and that is Awana Bible Clubs. Awana is a well-respected ministry that's been around since the 1970s. They start weekly Bible clubs for kids, and they have a strong emphasis on scripture memory. I was an Awana kid growing up. Maybe some of your kids were Awana kids growing up. I know how impactful it was in my life. In fact, just a few weeks ago, my daughter was digging through one of our trunks in our closet, and she found my old Awana vest. I was super proud of those patches, by the way. Well, last year, Awana had started a new South Sudan program, but they didn't have relationships with local pastors to get these clubs started. Well, relationships with local pastors happens to be one of our core competencies at every village. So we introduced them to the church at our pastor conferences in October. And, they came and shared a vision of discipling the next generation. And then this January, they came with us once again, and they led a Train the Trainers course, followed by a Seed Planters course to equip over 200 youth leaders to start these weekly Bible clubs in their churches. Well, the last day of training, we brought kids in from the community so that the youth leaders could practice an entire program. And for the next hour, as I watched kids running around, playing games, hearing Bible stories, being loved, my eyes filled up with tears. Honestly, I cried 3 times that day just thinking about it. I'm just getting emotional again now because these kids were getting to experience a childhood they've been robbed of because of war. They were getting to do something that we'd want for our own kids. Talk about sowing seeds that will bear lasting fruit. This is it. In the first month of these Bible clubs, we had 411 Bible club meetings, almost 26,000 kids coming, and over 3,000 of them committing their lives to the Lord. That was in February. And this is the vision I shared earlier coming to reality before our very eyes. Kids growing up in a world so different from their parents. One where they're free to be kids. One where they have a loving adult role model who spends time with them in the Word of God. Let's go. This is how we're building a nation for Christ. It's in the next generation. Speaking of the next generation, I've got one more story to share with you. That's the story of Magdalena. But before I get there, I want to talk about nuts and bolts. What on earth do nuts and bolts have to do with the next generation? Well, to begin to understand that, let me give you the quick nuts and bolts of our SWC well maintenance program. See, here's the dirty little secret about non-profit work and humanitarian work. Stuff breaks. And if there's not a maintenance plan in place, it stays broken. And there are so many examples of this worldwide where well-meaning donors gave to a need only for the solution to be short-term thinking. I remember being in Tanj in 2014, and we were visiting a water well that every village was drilling. Now, these were the days before we had our own compound, so we were actually riding in a Land Cruiser of another organization. It was used as an ambulance. And when we started out, first and second gear were already shot. So the driver was starting out of third gear every time we were going over a bump, of which there were many. Well, about an hour into the drive, third gear went out, and then fourth. And I remember the driver putting the truck into fifth gear, and he tried to keep pushing. Now, if you've ever tried starting a car out of fifth gear, you know this isn't great on the transmission. Smoke, grinding, clunk. We're broken down in the middle of the road. Thankfully, I brought a satellite phone, so I called someone back in town, and I asked them if they could try to find another car to send our way. Well, after another couple hours, we saw a car coming down the road. We were saved. And as it pulled up, I was shocked to see a Chevy logo emblazoned on the front of a 15-passenger van. There aren't any American cars over there. Well, then I walked around to the back side of the van, and I was even more shocked to see an Alaska license plate saying, "The Last Frontier." I think that van had finally found it. Well, as we talked to the driver on the way to the water well, he told us he had been one of the Lost Boys who had been resettled in Alaska, of all places, and his well-meaning Alaskan church had wanted to support him going home, and they'd offered to send over their old Chevy 15-passenger church van with Alaska plates to South Sudan. Well, that van saved us that day. But unfortunately, that's not the end of the story. Because a few months later, I was back in that area driving through Tanj Town, and I looked over to my right, and I saw an old Chevy 15-passenger church van with Alaska plates broken down inside a compound. And even if you were to visit Tanj today, you'd be able to see that same van sitting in the same place, broken down. Why? Because there's no way to get spare parts for a Chevy in East Africa, much less South Sudan. And even if this kind-hearted Alaskan church agreed to send over spare parts every time that van broke, there wouldn't be any car mechanics who would know how to fix a Chevy. And friends, this is South Sudan's problem. They're a graveyard of so many well-intentioned gifts. And I hate to say this, but that water well that we were drilling the day our car broke down was another example of one of those well-intentioned gifts. Because within a few short years, that water well was broken down too, without any pathway to repair. See, we were also part of that short-term project-oriented thinking. And by 2019, we had a big problem in our hands. That was the year we decided to do a survey of every village water well. And we found that only a third of them were fully functional. And that number was right in line with the national. Just like that Alaskan church, there have been so many other caring donors who've sent money into broken systems. Short-term gains, yes, but long-term stagnation. We can do better. See, this is where the nuts and bolts come in. This is the schematic of a water well from South Sudan. All the parts together would only cost about $450. But if any of those parts breaks, keeps the whole water well from functioning. Now, there are 9 nuts and bolts on a water well. And that whole package only costs about $5 of the total cost. But the cost to a girl in South Sudan is far more than $5 when one of those bolts breaks. Because when a bolt breaks, a well goes down. When a well goes down, a girl has to keep walking. And when a girl has to keep walking, she misses school. This is a story that's been repeated again and again with so many well-intentioned gifts. And that was Magdalena's story as well. I met her in 2019, and this is what she told me.
School is very important for me to reach my future. But every day, my family needs water, and I am the one to go and fill the jerrycan. There is one well near my home. which allows me to take water and still make it to school on time. But one day I got there, but the water was gone.
Many of South Sudan's systems are broken, especially access to water. This affects girls the most because they have to spend even more time in search of water. One by one, they drop out of school, robbing the nation of one more future. Every village is working to change this. We train local pump mechanics and provide spare parts to help get broken wells working again. We do all of this with sustainability in mind. That way, when a well does break, we can support the communities to get it back up and running as quickly as possible. And the beautiful thing is that when we fix a broken well, we are doing far more than just providing water. We are giving girls a future. These children are the next doctors, engineers, and peacemakers for this nation.
I want to be a doctor.
I want to be a business owner.
I want to be a nation changer.
My name is Magdalena. When I grow up, I want to be an engineer.
As I was standing in Magdalena's classroom that day, I remember seeing the strength, the purpose, the hope in each of these girls' eyes. And every time I watch this video, you know what part always gets to me? It's that teenage girl boldly stating, I want to be a nation changer. Wait, have I shared our vision with us enough tonight yet? Because this is it. It's empowering the South States with the opportunity to see such visions, with the boldness to dare and dream such dreams. South Sudan is a nation for Christ. Magdalena believes it's possible. Do we? But with such a young nation and such a hard past, our future's in the balance. It's still so fragile. So fragile that even one bolt breaking can rob a girl of her dreams. And you know what? For many years in our ministry areas, dreams were being lost for years. Wells were breaking. Girls were walking. Families were drinking filthy water. There were Magdalenas in every home. But in the last few years, that's starting to change. Through our Sustainable Water Cooperative, we're shifting that narrative. Communities are beginning to realize they don't ever have to walk past a broken water well to get dirty water again. They can maintain their water well. They can maintain their dignity, their health. Through SWC, communities form water committees that collect money from every household to pay an annual service fee as a part of a signed agreement. We then take pump mechanics that we've certified and assign them to SWC communities. These pump mechanics do monthly testing of their wells, and then they come to our spare parts store every time they need a repair job done. We oversee that system, and we guarantee that a community will have running water for an entire year. We fully launched this program just over 2 years ago, and it has taken off. Truly, the demand is outpacing the ability to scale the logistics in a country that doesn't have any roads or supply chain. We've now had 450 communities sign service agreements, and our water teams have facilitated almost 900 well repairs just in the last couple of years. And we have our next container of spare parts on its way from India right now, and in fact, it just landed on African soil last week. But due to shipping delays, our SCBC program is backlogged. Just 3 weeks ago, a water team sent me an email saying they have 101 more communities that are currently waiting to sign new service agreements. And here's the thing, all these numbers are just the tip of the iceberg. Because as we have this vision to spread the light of the gospel through radio to every village, we also are going to make sure that every village has access to a functioning water well. And just to cover the existing wells in the 20 regions that we've identified, we'll take another 5,000 SWC agreements. Even then, we're going to fall woefully short of what's needed, because it's not just existing wells that need to be covered, but new wells that have been drilled. Let me give you some perspective on how bad it really is in South Sudan. The UN recommends one water well for every 250 people in ideal rural environments. In a crisis situations, they recommend one well for every 400 people. How's South Sudan doing? Well, just to get to the crisis level, one well for every 400 people, South Sudan would need another 10,000 water wells to be drilled today. Yes, it is that bad. Let's look at Nasser, for instance. Again, this is where we just built our own airstrip because there's no other way to access it. It's that remote. And the greater Nasser region has around 565,000 people. But according to the most recent water well survey, they only have 80 water wells. You heard that right. 80. That's one water well for every 7,000 people, not 400. This is why we say South Sudan is not even a developing nation. It's a nation that's never even started. So where do all these people get their water from? They get it from places like this, and this. These pictures are horrifying to contemplate. But they're also pictures we just can't unsee and move on. The body of Christ has always been called to the hardest places, light in the darkness, streams in the desert, and so we go. And because of this need to drill another 10,000 water wells, that's why every village decided to buy our own drilling rigs last year. Because now that we've developed a functioning water sector, we need to begin to infuse it with the infrastructure that is so desperately lacking. This is a bold vision, a God-sized vision, but we serve a God-sized God, and He wants every village to have access to safe water. And here's where we're trying to get to. We don't want Magdalena or our classmates or our brothers and sisters to ever have to worry about that long walk for water again. We don't want them to ever miss another day of school because of a broken well. We don't want a broken bolt to rob another future. The good news, we've got 80 men and women dedicated to making sure it doesn't. As we go from Nasser to the next frontier, we're going to be joined by more men and more women who have this vision for their nation. And that's the most exciting part for me. Because when I look at the future of South Sudan, I see it becoming a nation for Christ. So why is now the time to invest in South Sudan? As I said, I've been doing this a long time. And I've never seen God more at work in this nation than He is today. The things we get to be a part of are special. I've seen a pure worship in South Sudan that shows me what it's going to be like around the throne room of heaven. I've joined families with hands with families in prayer that teach me what true dependence on God looks like. Truly, the years the locusts of Eden are being restored in our day. A new generation is sprouting up from the soil, and it's bearing fruit 30, 60, 100 times what is sown. And what farmer, when he sees it's time to plant, doesn't go out and plant? Because if we don't do it, no one else will.